As I mentioned, Steve has distinguished himself in government as well. In 2001, he served as a member of the staff of the Policy Planning Office at the U.S. State Department. Policy planning was created in 1947 by the legendary George Kennan at the request of Secretary of State George C. Marshall, and it serves as an independent source of policy analysis for the Secretary of State. Policy planning staff is to take a long-term strategic view of American policy. I think Steve's going to talk a bit about that today. In 2002, Steve moved over to the White House, where he served on the staff of the National Security Council as the Director for Governance and Development, and he worked on the pioneering Millennium Challenge account. And from 2005 to 2007, Steve was the Director of Policy Planning at the State Department, where he worked very closely with Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice. And by tradition, the Director of Policy Planning has been regarded as sort of one of the most intellectual members of the foreign policy operations in the United States and the U.S. government at the State Department. And we're blessed because actually we have not one but two former directors of policy planning at the State Department. Dean Jim Steinberg of the LBJ School has joined us as well, which we appreciate. Join me in welcoming Dr. Stephen Krasner.
Thanks. That was a very nice and generous introduction. One thing I've noticed about the length of introductions or the kind of biographies that people get in conference programs and such is the longer you live, the longer they get. You just keep doing stuff, you know? It's not that it's better or worse, there's just more of it as time goes on. Okay, so the title of this talk was 4 Policy Planning Stories in Search of a Theory. Since I actually offered the title, I think I found a theory. So this is something I've been thinking about for a year since I left government. And I'm going to start with the theory and then tell the stories and see if I can integrate the stories into the theory. So a real challenge is, I mean, if you're an academic working in government, is to try and think about, you know, what's the relationship between these two worlds. It's obvious that these worlds are very different. And that they connect with each other, but far from perfectly. And the issue is, I mean, how do you think about, you know, what this world, how these two worlds actually join together? This closing the gap idea, which is a term that I think actually originally came from my colleague Alexander George, is one way of thinking about these issues. I'm going to actually argue here that I think it's a wrong way of thinking about the issues. So let me begin. I mean, the question for me was, I mean, could I find a theoretical framework which somehow captured what went on in government in a way that would allow me to write about it in a way that was academically interesting. And when I was in Washington for the first time in 2001 and 2002, I did kind of, you know, out of the miasma of stuff that I'd read when I was doing organizational theory, think that what you really, the most appropriate kind of policy-making model that I thought was out there was a garbage can model, which was a model that was developed in the 1970s, primarily by Jim March, who was an organizational theorist, is an organizational theorist at Stanford, and a couple of his colleagues, I mean, one Cohen at Michigan, and Johan Olsen, who teaches in Norway. And the basic idea of the garbage can model was this, and they start off the 1972 article by saying that they're writing about what they call organized anarchies, and in fact, their example is universities. And that organized anarchies are characterized by the following 3 things. One is, actors within these environments, these organizational environments, have unclear preference orderings. Secondly, the participants in any particular decision-making process change over time, or sometimes change very rapidly. I mean, I know when people have asked me about, you know, how do I put together the best, you know, I want to get into graduates, a PhD program. How do I put together the best record? I mean, what I always say is, you know, these are not committees like undergraduate admission where they're kind of routinized. You have faculty members on these committees, they change every year. Different faculty members have different views about what's useful. So there is no way of sort of thinking about what your ideal CV would look like. And finally, so you have changing participants, unclear preference orderings, and things operate by trial and error. And I want to read a couple of quotes from actually the second page of their article. Okay, this is from the March Cohen and Olsen article in 1972. From this point of view, an organization is a collection of choices looking for problems, issues and feelings looking for decision situations in which they might be aired, solutions looking for issues to which they might be an answer, and decision makers looking for work. And they go on to say, to understand the process within organizations, one can view a choice opportunity as a garbage can into which various problems and solutions are dumped by participants as they are generated. The mix of garbage in a single can depends on the mix of cans available, on the labels attached to the alternative cans, on what garbage is currently being produced, and on the speed with which garbage is collected and removed from the scene. All right, the basic argument here is that policy processes in any kind of complex organization don't follow the rational actor model, something we've critiqued for a long time. You know, they don't follow either Lindblom's kind of incremental model because you can have some dramatic changes. But they're a lot the result of random processes when a problem, a solution, and a person happen to come together. John Kingdon, who actually also originally writing in the 1970s, wrote a book about the policymaking process. The book was mainly based on empirical work that he had done about transportation and health. We'd spent a lot of time interviewing people in Washington on these two issue areas. And Kingdon reframed this March, Cohn, and Olson framework in a way that I actually found more helpful, and that I have to say rang true to me in terms of my observations about Washington. So what Kingdon says is, if you want to understand the policy process, what you have to understand is that there are three streams involved in the policymaking process. These streams are more or less independent. They kind of flow at their own rate. And policy outcomes are the result of a haphazard convergence when these streams happen to come together for reasons that are more a result of, they're not quite random, but they're not the result of any kind of logical policy-making process. The first stream is what Kingdon calls policy generation. Problem generation. That is, why do people come to recognize some things as problems and other things as not? And he points to crises as one reason. And in looking at transportation, the potential the bankruptcy of Penn Central, which could have crippled the Northeast Corridor, is an example of this. Budget demands, legislative renewals, feedback, information on how something is working can all be mechanisms that can generate problems. In foreign policy, I do think that most of the problems are actually generated by external crises or demands, although some of them are certainly generated internally as well. So problem generation is the first stream that's flowing. The second is what Kingdon calls generation of policy alternatives. What kind of solutions are available out there? And this policy alternative stream is made up of bureaucrats, think tanks, and academics. And something that I did find extremely useful in this framework is to recognize that academics, are only one part, especially in the United States, of a really big and actually quite robust process that involves people from inside the government and outside the government. And this policy alternative stream develops policy proposals. If these proposals are going to survive, they have to be technically feasible. They have to in some way fit with policymakers' ideology. So someone working in a bureaucracy may have a set of ideas which are completely inconsistent with the people that are actually running the country at a particular time.